we have had the great opportunity to get producer Signe Byrge Sørensen and director Joshua Oppenheimer nominated for the Oscar for his film The Act of Killing, which you've probably all seen. I would like to welcome on stage again John Jackson, who will be in conversation with these awesome guests. Welcome.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. You can all be a little mean to us, like you would be to a substitute teacher, because we're not the the one who's supposed to be here. You can throw spitballs and boo and put a thumbtack in the apple.
I think you're an exciting surprise for people, so you won't get anything thrown at you. Not quite yet, anyway. So
by the end, we will.
There might be 1 or 2 people left in Copenhagen who've not heard about your films or seen your films. It's probably unlikely in this audience, but I think just in case, it would be really good if you could just give us a brief kind of overview of the 2 films that you've made and how you did it and you know, yeah.
So very briefly, in 2003, I started working with a community of survivors of the 1965-66 genocide in Indonesia, where with Western support, is this working? Yeah, it is, okay. Something like anywhere between 500,000 and 2.5 million people who were opponents of a Western-backed military coup were labeled potential communists or communist sympathizers and were killed. The victims were members of trade unions, doctors, teachers, intellectuals, writers, the ethnic Chinese, members of any movements pushing for land reform, the Indonesian women's movement. So a huge, broad, basically the entire Indonesian left was labeled communist. And then the Chinese were also labeled communist and then put in concentration camps or murdered. And when we began this work, very quickly the army threatened the survivors not to participate in a film. Because the killers are still in power and more or less still hold power throughout the country until today. And if not the killers, then their protege, they're people who came up in power under them. So after we were stopped from making a work with the survivors with whom I was working said, don't go home and quit, try and film the perpetrators. And when I did that, I found, really to my horror, that all of them were boastful about what they had done because they had never been forced to admit it was wrong, because they still held power. And to expose this whole present-day regime of impunity, and I emphasize that because I don't think either of my films are about the events of 1965 per se. They're about a present-day regime built by the killers. To expose that and to expose the moral vacuum and the corruption that comes with that, I spent 7 years, from 2003 to 2010, filming with perpetrators, and then from that material created The Act of Killing. It's really a film about the stories, the lies that perpetrators tell to justify their actions, the fantasies into which they escape. It's a film about fantasy and escapism and guilt and the terrible political and social effects of that. And then I always knew I would make another film which is equally about today and equally urgent about what happens what does it do to ordinary human beings to have to live, and for survivors in particular, to have to live for 50 years in fear and in silence? What does it do to our ability to heal, to our ability to raise a family, to be a mother, to be a child? What does it do to our ability to be human? And that's a film called The Look of Silence. It premiered at the Venice Film Festival in August, and it was playing in Copenhagen docks, but now it is on general release across Denmark. So if you want to see the film and you read Danish, it's out in cinemas now. That's a film about a survivor, a brother of a man who was killed, who finds out how his brother was killed through my old footage with perpetrators, and then decides to confront all of the men who were involved with murdering his brother. Something unprecedented in Indonesia, because there's never in Indonesia has a survivor confronted a perpetrator in this way. And in fact, I think never in the history of documentary film have survivors confronted perpetrators on film while the perpetrators still are completely in power, before they've been removed from power in any way, shape, or form. So that's The Look of Silence, and that's out now. So if you're Danish, go see it in the cinema if you haven't seen it yet.
Thank you for that. How possible is it for people in Indonesia to see, well, the first film and now the second film?
Well, The Act of Killing is now widely available because after a year after the release, we put it out on the internet in the Indonesian version, and they can download it for free. But the story is much longer than that. We actually, from the very beginning, we worked with both in producing the films and in all the thinking about how to get the films out. We work with a huge Indonesian crew, and they have been totally involved and engaged in bringing out the film. But we knew from the start with The Act of Killing, from talking to them and getting advice from human rights organizations and so on in Indonesia, that it wouldn't work if we wanted to get it out in a normal cinema release in Indonesia. Because in order to do that, you have to submit it to a censorship board, and if the censorship board says that either that it can't go out, or even if it goes out in a cut down version or whatever, then it becomes illegal and problematic for the people who then bring out the real version. Right. So we knew we didn't want to do that, but there is a kind of a gray area in Indonesia that if you haven't submitted the film to the censorship board and you're screening it in venues or locally in universities and libraries and so on, then it's possible. Because it's not commercial, it's cine clubs, it's closed circuits and so on. And that also, we knew that if we organized it in this way, the people distributing it would be able to know who are coming to the screenings and make the screenings in a safe way and so on. So we knew from the start that we wanted to do something like that, or not from the start, but from around the time when The Act of Killing was finished, we went to Indonesia and had a whole session there with various people who could advise about how we should do it, and that's the plan we came up with. But the aim was always to get it out as widely as possible in Indonesia, and therefore we also, from the start, knew that we wanted to make a strategy where we kind of fed in from whatever happened internationally with the film into the Indonesian press. So it was very important for us to get the highest possible profile for the film from the very start. So getting the premiere of The Act of Killing was in Telluride and Toronto, and that was the first point where the film hit any headlines, and that was the time where the first trailer went out, and that of course also went to Indonesia straight away and all over the place. That was in Toronto is in the beginning of September. And the most important day in Indonesia for the events of 65 is the 30th of September. So around that time, our Indonesian crew, they organized screenings for journalists and human rights people and celebrities and filmmakers, anyone we thought could be great carriers of this film and support it and write about it. And the most important thing that happened was it was a newspaper editor for a magazine called Tempo, a political magazine, where they decided, or he decided together with his team, to send out their journalists to all corners of Indonesia and in a way replicate what the film does with Anwar as the main character. So he was asking his journalists to find out if people other places in Indonesia would also be able to find perpetrators that would boast like Anwar and talk like Anwar about what had happened. And they found that, and they found huge amounts of testimony like that. And they made a special edition of Tempo with 75 pages of those kind of articles with these kind of perpetrators from other places. And they also wrote about the film for 25 pages, and that magazine came out then around October. And then on the 10th of December is International Human Rights Day, and that was the first day where we had screenings in many, many different places. But these kind of community screenings, gray area screenings, not commercial cinema screenings. And then they just continued and worked with getting out videos, sending to organizations, organizing screenings, debates, talks, and working with the press as much as possible. And every time we had any international event that just went to, or we had a big festival, or there was a release in a country, or the film won a prize, we would feed that back into the Indonesian press so that they would keep writing about it and keeping it on the agenda. And the last part of that process, it's a process that's still going, and that was why it's so important to get The Look of Silence out now to keep it going. But another sort of key point in that whole campaign was around the Oscars, because the Oscars is something everyone have heard about around the world, and when the film was nominated for that, that gave us a new chance to actually write about it and get reactions. And that was, maybe you can explain about what happened with the...
Luckily, it didn't pull off my head. One thing I just say about the community screenings, because that was such a great overview, is that they started private, but by the end there had been thousands of them, and because of high-level celebrity endorsement and the kind of media coverage Signe described, by the end most of them were publicly announced through Twitter, Facebook, online organizations. They were so the fear gradually disappeared. And there was a sense, people would say, especially once we made the film available online, people would say, well, we would say, be careful. We had a screening guide which recommended security steps, but people would say, look, it's out there anyways. I'm not going to act afraid by making the screening closed when people are going to watch it anyhow. So by the time the Oscars came around, we knew we weren't going to win an Academy Award for this film for a few reasons. One, it's the weirdest film ever to be nominated for an Academy Award. And secondly...
it doesn't have a happy end.
It doesn't. Well, the Academy has rules which were really great for us, but that the whole Academy watches the film, and we knew that we were having a lot of trouble just getting the documentary branch of the Academy to watch the film, which is what you need to get it nominated. So we thought, if that's hard, it will be really hard to get the whole Academy to watch it. And it was great, the change in rules, that the whole Academy gets the film, because it meant that a lot of really important people who've now become allies for The Look of Silence did watch it. People like Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie, people like Martin Scorsese, who will help make an even bigger noise around the new film. So I'm not complaining about that at all. And but what it meant was we were focused when we did get nominated that this is a short window. Between now and the time that we don't win at the Oscars, we have this short window to use the nomination to make a lot of noise about this issue. So we worked with activist groups that projected the film on the side of the World Bank to highlight Western corporations' complicity with the military dictatorship. The whole World Bank staff came out and watched, not officially, but just on their way out of work, just gathered and watched the movie projected on their office. We held screenings for senators and congressmen on Capitol Hill with the message that please introduce a resolution demanding that the US declassify all the documents about its role in the genocide and apologize for that. That's something that's happening now, and is still going on. And then the nomination forced the Indonesian government to finally speak about the film. Until that time, they'd been silent about it, I think hoping that it would just go away. But finally, when it was nominated, they felt they had to say something, and they said, look, we know that what happened in 1965 was a crime against humanity, but we don't need a film to make us deal with this. So they didn't support the film in any way. They were nasty about the film, but it was a great moment because it was the first time ever the Indonesian government had said anything other than the 1965 genocide was something to be celebrated. Suddenly they were saying it was a crime against humanity, so we, of course, called them on that and said, exactly, our point. And Indonesians got angry in the press. How can you say we don't need a foreigner making a film about this when 60 Indonesians have given 8 years of their lives to make this film? And because of that kind of arrogant stance from the government, they have to hide their identity to protect their safety rather than enjoy the credit that they deserve for their work. So it kind of backfired on the government in a good way, and helped with yet another step in breaking the official silence on this, which meant, to answer the other part of your question, about The Look of Silence. The Look of Silence now comes, you could say fairly, by the end of it, the act of killing had helped to sort of catalyze a transformation in how Indonesia talks about its past, officially and in the media and among the public, and sort of open this stage onto which we can bring out the Look of Silence. So the Look of Silence's premiere happened on the 10th of November, 3 or 4 days ago,
Monday.
4 days ago, Monday. Yeah. And it was, in contrast with those early secret screenings of The Act of Killing, it was held in Indonesia's largest theater, an 850-person venue. It sold out immediately, the screening. So they did 2 screenings, both of which were sold out, so about 1,700 people saw the film on Monday. The screening was hosted by the government, by the National Human Rights Commission, and by the Jakarta Arts Council. There were banners and billboards on the area of Jakarta near the screening, announcing the screening. And Adi Rukun, the main character in the film, was able to go and speak after both screenings, and he received a 10-minute standing ovation after each screening for his courage. And and there was a big official press conference, and now many only positive press about this film coming out in the National Human Rights Commission and the media saying this film shows how urgently we need truth and reconciliation, and let's push the government to move forward on that.
Well, I mean, you've kind of answered one of the other questions I had, which was what has been the impact in Indonesia? And I guess there's 2 forms of impact. There's the psychological, emotional impact on so many people who lived during that period, who both perpetrated crimes but also who were victims of crimes. And then there's what is the political possibilities for what happened and what should be done as a consequence of what happened. And I wonder whether you could just expand a bit more on that.
Well, I think it's first of all, the 1965 genocide is not just any human rights violation in Indonesia. There were other horrific ones, including the invasion and occupation of East Timor, which claimed the lives of 1/3 of the population of East Timor. 200,000 people died as a result of that. But what's important about it is that it's like the original sin of the Suharto regime. It's this enormous traumatic event that meant that unlike many Western-sponsored dictatorships, the Suharto regime was able to, notwithstanding what I just said about East Timor, was able to rule with relatively little violence inside the non-occupied territories of Indonesia. There was violence, there were ongoing repression, there were, particularly in East Timor and of course and in other secessionist regions trying to break away from Indonesia, but in most of Indonesia, the repression didn't have to be so violent because people were so traumatized by what had happened in 1965, and the left and any opposition was completely exterminated. So there was this resounding silence that went on for decades and decades. And this fear that therefore, because there wasn't outright violence all the time, fear that just got internalized and then forgotten. So people would be, and that's even more dangerous. People would be afraid, they'd forget it. They'd forget that they were afraid, they would internalize the fear to the point that it became a habit, and then they'd become apathetic and feel powerless.
And so but they would also have forgotten how to organize. Because if you don't organize in a society for a long time, that idea of how to do it, those practices, those connections, those networks disappear. So that's another.
You also, and also the one thing that's not good for community organizing is heroism, and that you just sort of are looking to make yourself a hero or find a hero. So, because organizations take a lot of time to be built by many people who make different kinds of contributions all the time, and everybody needs to be a part of it, and everyone's invaluable. So when you have this total banning of any political activity, collective activity, organization, then you get these popular moments where people rise up in anger and sort of heroism, but they almost self-immolate. They kind of, burn out quickly. Because they're heroic, and then that's it. So this kind of rebuilding, all of this means that to break the silence, and particularly to get over the fear of talking about 1965, is like the kind of key to unlocking the door to real political change. Now, whether that political change and social change comes is something that's up to the Indonesian people, and that we are doing it in our small way, whatever we can to support, and so are so many other people. But people often ask me, why haven't you made a trilogy? Because that's more common than a diptych. I sort of feel that the 2 films circle back on each other. It's like there's something, it's like a cycle, even though it's only 2. But that there's something more open-ended about about two films, in that there's a kind of provocation, there's a kind of argument about what needs to happen, and then part 3 belongs to the people of Indonesia.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Signe, and thank you, Joshua.
Thank you, Joshua. Thank you, Signe. Thank you, John Jackson,
That's
for taking this conversation.